fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Joining me, we are talking about crime fiction, and we've got a great writer here, Charles Cutter. Thank you for talking to us.
Alan, thanks for having me.
Okay, now before we get into your new book, it's called Bare Bones. Let's talk about you. Where did the writing come from?
Well, my mother actually taught English at Michigan State University, and both my parents are big readers, so I ended up being a big reader. And then what happened was, in a prior life, I owned some radio stations, and I had a particularly failing radio station in East Lansing that was just across just across the road from Michigan State, across Grand River. So, not having anything else to do at lunch or other times of the day, I took English courses and writing courses at Michigan State because I always had an interest in that, and then that's how I got involved in actual creative writing, and that was some time ago. The radio station, I sold the radio station and then sort of moved on from there.
There must have been a lot of pressure if you have parents that are like, an English teacher and heavy readers. Did you feel a lot of pressure to show them your first book or writing?
I did. Actually, I did. My mother was a real perfectionist and taskmaster, so she was very supportive, but she had a lot of comments. So I did feel, it's a good question. I did feel some pressure there, but, she did it in, I think, as loving a way as a stern teacher can do it. So it was mostly positive. Oh boy, yes. Well, and the first copy editor didn't do such a great job. So some of the things I got blamed for were mistakes really that I hadn't made. But, anyway, we got those corrected. So I had broad shoulders and no lasting damage. No kidding. Well, I was always interested in, and this goes partly back to my family, but when I was growing up, Perry Mason was on television, and our house stopped when Perry Mason came on. So I grew up, with Raymond Burr and Paul Drake and Della Street. And so we watched that, and then I enjoyed reading it, reading it myself. I read, a lot of the Dash Hammett books and a bunch of the famous mystery writers. And then I read, not many people know this, but Agatha Christie actually wrote a courtroom drama that was a play called Witness for the Prosecution that was made into a really good movie with Charles Lawton. And I just, for some reason, picked up on that and thought, I'd really like to write a mystery courtroom drama. And Alan, I don't know what happened, popped into my head. And as a recovering attorney, I had some experience with that. So I felt like I could do that and write from a place where I felt that I had the knowledge to write from.
Well, I would think you'd get into true crime.
Yeah, these are a little bit more literary, and they have hopefully some pretty interesting characters and good character development. So I really wanted to stay, more in the courtroom drama part of it, although our protagonist, Burr Lafayette, does end up doing a fair amount of detective work as he tries to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting. So when you create a character, like you've got, this is the new book, Bare Bones, that's part of your Burr Lafayette's mystery book, and it's number 3. So your character there, Burr, how do you develop that character? Like, where do you get the ideas from, and how do you create them?
Well, that's a good question. Well, the first thing is that I am not Burr Lafayette, and he's not me. I get asked that all the time. We share some similar characteristics, but I'm not. My behavior is not nearly as bad as his. I'm not nearly as outrageous. I don't drink nearly as much, and I'm not divorced. But I sort of put myself when things, and I know you're a writer too, but and it probably happens to all writers, and it doesn't happen as often as I like. But when I really get going, I sort of get into the mind and the persona of the character, and things just happen. And I probably sounds like a silly explanation, but that's what happens. And there's other characters in the series who behave in fairly predictable ways, and do not the same things over and over again, but they have their own character traits, and I can get into their personas also, and that's really how it works. And I have a very active imagination, so things pop into my head at all times of the day and night, and I try and write them down, remember them, and if they're good enough, put them in a book.
Yeah, I was going to say you'd have to have imagination, but I wonder. So on these characters you have that you write, are they based on anybody you know, or is it someone you might run across in the street, or someone you might see in a coffee shop, or you're walking through the mall and you see someone doing or saying something? Does that sort of spark the idea?
It does, and it's all of those things. There are some characters that are loosely based on. All these stories are fiction, and all the characters are fictional, but there are some real people that I've drawn at least parts of characters from, and it could be as simple as walking down the street and seeing somebody whose hair is combed in a certain way, or whose nose looks a certain way, or who says things in a certain way. And a couple of the reviewers have said that they like the minor characters in these books because they're colorful. So I try and each character has their own part, and he or she has their own function in the book. But I try and make them distinctive enough so they're not bland and gray. There's a character in The Gray Drake, which is the second book in the series, and she thinks she's a key witness, and has quite overweight and has henna-colored hair, and has been at a bingo party, and she says she was drinking iced tea, but it really was something much stronger than that. And Burr calls her testimony into question over that, and that was loosely based on an actual person whose name will not be mentioned.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just wonder. Speaking of Courtroom, have you watched the new Perry Mason series?
I have.
Yeah.
I enjoy it. I mean, I think those things were, they were terrific. And I haven't read all the Earl Stanley Gardner books, but I read quite a few of them. And I didn't know this at the time, but Burr, his sidekick isn't Paul Drake, but it's another lawyer named Jacob Wertheim, who's a very fussy man with with olive complexion and really steel wool hair, and he's very, very fussy. And one of my friends asked me if he was patterned after my law school roommate, and I said no. And then he also has a long-suffering longtime legal assistant named Eve McGinty, who isn't at all like Della Street, but she tries to keep Burr in line. She's sort of the conscience of the whole parade there, because Burr, left to his own devices, he'd rather be sailing his boat or duck hunting or drinking a martini. So she kind of keeps the whole crew together, and he recognizes and says to himself frequently that, she's smarter than he and Jacob put together, and that's probably true.
Yeah. It's quite the difference from the Perry Mason series you see from.
Well, that's right. And in the Perry Mason series, there's no backstory. It starts in court, it ends in court. We don't know anything about, how any of those characters grew up, what their houses look like, what their families look like. It's just that. And these books are different in that way, in that there is backstory and some personal life and other character traits.
Well, it was probably of the times, because if you think back in the 50s and 60s, that wasn't something that they paraded around. We didn't want to bring in all that personal stuff, because it would force us to deal with real life, so to speak.
Right. No, you're right. Although I'm sure you remember Anatomy of a Murder. That was a great book and a great movie, but there was some. Jimmy Stewart, wanted to go fly fishing, and I think he had some of his own money trouble. So I don't know if that's where it started, but there were. Robert Traver had some. He did have some of that, and he actually, as you probably know, was a Supreme Court judge in the state of Michigan.
Funny things. Now, your characters, are they very personal to you?
Yeah, they are. In fact, I try and do my best to take care of them. I try and get them into just enough trouble that they can get out of without having serious poor consequences. Burr has almost been killed a couple times. His constant companion is an aging Labrador Retriever called Zeke, who he thinks so much of that he was able to persuade his ex-wife to name their son after the dog. So there's a Zeke the boy and a Zeke the dog in these books. And I've had a number of comments that people thought that was, outrageous, but that's what happened in the book.
How does that go now? Because today, with social media and all of this stuff that we have, what's it like for you, the interaction with people that comment like that, negative and positive? Is it something you take real serious, or do you try to avoid it?
I respond to every email or Facebook message or phone call that I get. I think it's important to, if somebody cares enough to buy a book I wrote, I'm always grateful. And if they care enough to make a comment, I reply. And fortunately, there's a lot more positives than negatives, but there are some negatives. And after, cursing and stomping around, I try and, look at what they said and see if it makes sense, and sometimes it does. So, I think they're very good books. They're not perfect books, and I'm always, I'm trying to learn something.
Mm. So when you write these books, like when someone reads, if they pick up Bare Bones and they take it home and read it, other than the story, other than the actual upfront story or mystery, is there something underlying that you want them to take home?
Well, the first thing is these can be read in any order. So you don't have to start with the Pink Pony, which is the first one. But yes, there is, I think that I try and convey that there is some rationality in the world and there is some justice. It may not be perfect justice. It may not be all tied up neatly in a bow, but there is some justice in the world and some sense of fairness. So that's a very good question. I do try and convey that. And they all take place in Michigan, mostly in northern Michigan, which is beautiful. It's like it's somewhat like Seattle without the mountains. There's all kinds of lakes, all kinds of trees. And I call these books Brutal Murders in Beautiful Places. So I try and convey the settings are really characters in the books. So Bare Bones, for instance, takes place. If you were to put your left hand palm out and spread your thumb, that's the mitten, that's Michigan. But if you put your little finger out, that's called the little finger of Michigan. And the Sleeping Bear Dunes, where the book takes place, is right at the outside of your little fingernail. And it was the last national park formed. It's about 25 miles of breathtaking scenery along Lake Michigan. The Sleeping Bear Dunes are 300 or 400 feet tall. I climbed them. It's way easier, like, going down than up. And there's a great Indian or Native American legend that goes with the Sleeping Bear Dunes, and it's a beautiful area. But there was some controversy when the park was formed. There was a lot of government, federal, state, and local government land that was all put together. It took a very long time to get this done. But there was quite a bit of private land, and the Park Service decided that they wanted to have one big parcel. So they bought quite a bit, but there were a bunch of people who had businesses and farms and cottages and homes there who didn't want to sell. So they began a process of condemnation, and some of the locals still remember that. So the park wasn't formed without some controversy, and when the book opens, Burr is in court defending this woman named Helen Lockwood and her sisters, who own a 400-acre cherry farm that really is the gateway to the park, and the government has to have it. She disappears. A year later, her body's found in a shallow grave on South Manitou Island, which is part of the park and part of the legend. And then her husband's arrested for murder, and then that's how it starts. And most of these books are about half mystery and half courtroom drama. There's a fair amount of courtroom scenes in each of the books.
I guess that's where your recovering lawyer part comes from. I guess that helps a lot with describing
it does.
scenes in the courtroom, right? Yeah, wow. That's so when you have characters that die off or get killed off, are they people you know?
Well,
I asked that because J.D. Orn, who does a lot of books, he said that if you're killed off in his book, it's someone that he wanted to kill, and he takes that person. So I have to ask that now.
Yeah, that's a very fair question. I would say that the three victims do bear some resemblance to at least characteristics of real people. And the way these books are set up, the murder takes place in the first chapter, so we know who it is. And then one of the tricks after that is the reader still needs to get to know these people, even though they aren't in the action, because they're dead. So that's a little bit, you have to do that the right way so that they get to know them even though they're not in the book. They get to like them. They get to not like them. They get to think, well, maybe they did deserve to be killed. Maybe they didn't. And, that's by page 10 of all my books, someone's dead.
Well, stay away from the first 10 pages. So what are your influences as far as for writing? We have, and there's a couple of Michigan writers that I really like. Tom McGuane, who doesn't write mysteries, who grew up in Michigan and moved to Montana, and Jim Harrison, who recently deceased, who was a great writer who actually lived where Bare Bones was written. In terms of mystery thriller writers, I like Scott Turow. I like Walter Mosley. I like some of the classic, Dash Hammett. There's a historical
fiction espionage writer named Alan Furst, F-U-R-S-T, who I also quite like. But, I try and be eclectic and read a bunch of things all the time, so I can, for pleasure, because I love to read, but also to learn things. And I can usually pick something up or understand why somebody did something. So I'd say those are my favorite. I have read Anatomy of a Murder at least twice. It's probably due to be read again pretty soon. So those are. I used to read Nero Wolfe all the time. I don't know if you remember Nero Wolfe.
Yeah.
That was Rex Stout. Those are really old books.
Wow.
Those are a few.
Yeah. And so what do you think of Truman Capote? Did you like that In Cold Blood, or?
I did.
Yeah.
Like In Cold Blood, and it was hard to believe that he also wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's. But I did read In Cold Blood shortly after it came out. And I read, and I needed to read Breakfast at Tiffany's twice because there's a lot going on in that book that if you don't pay attention, it's short and breezy, but if you don't pay attention, at least a lot went over my head the first time through.
Oh, yeah. That's one of those things. With that, you learn things as time goes by. It's really weird.
Right.
It's crazy. So do you have any advice, let's say, for a new writer, someone that's just coming out and they're writing crime fiction? What do you suggest for them?
I don't know that I have any new suggestions, but it does really help. It is so much easier to write about what you know about because it just saves a lot of time, and you don't need to worry about, did I get this right or, not right. I don't really write police procedurals because I'm not as well versed in, the actual police work, but that's why I do courtroom dramas, because I've been in court and I have a pretty good idea of how that goes. I think the other thing is it's nice to have some discipline and pick a time and just write something. And then I'd say be patient with yourself, because it really, I look at some of the stuff that I wrote, I look at it and I want to throw up and just throw it away, and then I put it down, I go walk the dogs and come back to it, and maybe I can find something worthwhile in there later, although there's a lot of, I edit on it with a computer, but I write on yellow pads, and there's a lot of, crumpled up pieces of yellow pad paper around.
Yeah. Well, I think that's common. I find that with myself. A lot of times you'll look at something and go, wow, that's terrible. Or,
Yeah,
I think that's just.
I try and accept my humanity to allow myself to write terrible. Well, I know we're not supposed to curse on the air, but there's a very famous saying that I took to heart. It says, allow yourself to write a shitty first draft. And I think that's really important. And as a fellow writer, you probably would agree with that.
Oh, for sure. And there has to be a point where you let it go and you move on to the next book too, right? Because you can always be going back and correcting things or making things different or better in your mind. So. Oh boy, is that true? And now with print on demand, there's no end to it, right? Yeah. You can just keep doing it, and I find I have to stop. The editor says, "Okay, that's it. I don't really care how much better it can be. We're not changing this anymore." Yeah.
So.
There's a part of going too far. You just have to let it go.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know, because I know you're not writing about something that's, with modern times, let's say, or what's going on. But do events like what happened in 2020, all the protests, the COVID, all the conspiracy, just all of the stuff going on, and the tension, does that seep into your writing, do you think? Do you think that you kind of become darker maybe in some of your tones in writing, or do you keep it out completely?
No, I don't keep it out completely. These books all take place in the 80s, so the current event parts themselves don't get in, but some of the darknesses, there's always some say police officer, judge, and or prosecutor character, other lawyer who has some, dark motivations that we have to learn about as things go on. Our friend Burr is a brilliant litigator, but he's really a man at loose ends, and his personal life's a mess. But he went to the University of Michigan Law School, which is where I went, and it's one of the finest law schools in the country. But he was the head of a big litigation department in a big downtown Detroit firm who's fallen on hard times and moved to East Lansing. And some of my classmates from law school aren't really very happy that I chose a Michigan lawyer who is a little bit down on his luck because it's a little bit of an oxymoron. So Burr is really iconoclastic and sort of very independent, somewhat aloof, and he either pokes fun or takes jabs at the establishment. And I would say that some of today's current events are like that, and that probably does leak or seep or find its way into my writing somewhere.
Yeah. I was just wondering because it seems like some writers totally incorporate anything dark or negative around them into what they're writing. Others can block it out. Myself, it kind of stops my writing. I find that I don't write as much, even though it's kind of weird. It's nothing to do with...
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of strange. I kind of get stuck. I get in a mode where it isn't going to work. So I don't know why. It becomes more of a struggle for me. Not that I'm completely focused on everything. It's just that it's there,
Well, the events of the day, especially these days, can certainly be paralyzing, and different people have different reactions. So, some people sort of breeze through things, and some people take it very seriously, and it's hard. It's a little bit hard to predict who's going to react how. I went into we have a cottage in northern Michigan, and my father's 97, and he loves pie, so we went into this. It's called the House of Pies to buy a pie, right? And you have to wear a mask going in, which is just fine, but the baker didn't have a mask on. They did have some shields, but I didn't care. And there's a sign that says, "This is an old-fashioned pie place. We use sugar, flour, local fruit, and Crisco. And so we're not gluten-friendly, and we're not whatever else it was. So if that doesn't work, don't come in." And I thought, okay, that was at least pretty clear, and that was how they were dealing with all this. But their pies are delicious.
Yeah, well, it's just crazy. Do you feel? What do you feel about, like, you write for your books are really kind of, like you said, in the 80s. So one, I guess, so many different things were happening in the 80s as compared to what's going on now. So, but when you write back in a time period like that, do you just remember it all, or do you have to go back and do research to make sure that things around your characters are accurate?
Both. I remember quite a bit, but I do need to do some research, whether it's online or talking to people to make sure that I get things right. Like, for instance, in Bare Bones, Burr is a great Detroit Tigers fan. Well, at the time, and I didn't remember this for sure, and you probably don't know this, but the Tigers had one of the best shortstop double play combinations in baseball. They had Lou Whitaker played second, and Alan Trammell was the shortstop, and I had to go back and make sure that I had that right. There's a little popular music in there. I had to make sure I had the right songs of the era. In this book, cell phones are just coming out, and there's some humor in these books. It's not all gloom and doom and drama. And Burr doesn't really like to be in the office, so he thinks that buying a cell phone is going to, make everything better. But I'm sure, as you recall, when those first cell phones came out, they hardly worked, right? And there's a whole bit about Burr and his cell phone. And he finally hangs up and says, "Look, I can't hear you. Call me back call me back from a phone booth." And of course, there's no phone booths anymore either. So
yeah, the big brick phones.
Right. So there's some nostalgia in these as well, and I would say maybe looking back, everything it was a simpler time, but it sure seems simpler, which is, a little bit of an advantage of writing about something that occurred some time ago. I think people have a warmer, happier feeling, about the recent past than certainly they might have about today.
Yeah, I think it always seems that way. Our memory's short, and we seem to try to hold on to the good things, I guess, because
right.
If look at the riots and the protests in the '60s and the shooting of the president, and then the '70s and Black Panthers and Patty Hearst, and you just think of the unrest throughout the whole time. It's just that I think the past, it gets settled, or we think it gets settled.
Right.
And so
those were violent times. I mean, you're really right about that, and I'm sure you remember where you were when Kennedy, and what you were doing when Kennedy was assassinated.
Well, I was pretty young still then, but so I don't. I was just a couple years old, so I don't really. But it certainly had an influence. But I think everything throughout those times, and we soon to forget, and I think that the way it is now is sometimes it's different circumstances, but we go through these, and everybody's all upset and panicked. And if you calm down, you got to realize that God, it wasn't perfect in the '60s or the '70s or even the '80s. We were dealing with our stuff then too, and it seemed like the end. You're
right. That's a very good point. You're exactly right.
Well, and plus we feel like we resolve it, like McCarthyism or whatever was the thing of the day, and then it gets resolved, or we move on, and we sort of forget then, and now. It's just something that we have no answers for. So I think people, it's the being unsure. I think that scares people. But
I think that's right. Well, I think probably plenty.
Well, no. I'm just a youngin. So that's interesting. That's amazing. Now, do you have a website as well that people can go to and find you?
Okay. CharlesCutter.com, and also a Facebook page.
Perfect. And you don't mind people joining you on Facebook or saying hi?
No, that'd be terrific. That would be terrific. I'd respond. There's Facebook is very democratic in the sense that when people write reviews, they get posted whether they're good or bad. So fortunately, they're almost all good. But if you scroll down far enough, there's something for everybody. So
yeah. It's kind of crazy. That sure has changed our world, hasn't it? The way social media is. I never saw this coming.
No, and I need to be careful. I'm careful with it, just because the famous saying is words unspoken you're a master of, words spoken you're a prisoner of. So I try and be very careful in email, text, and Facebook and everything else about. I mean, I don't want to be bland or benign, but once it's out there, it's out there.
Oh yeah, write it, regret it.
Yeah, no kidding.
Say it, forget it. The thing is, I just I get myself into trouble all the time. I'm always, so I find myself pulling away from a lot of the social media because I realize that I grew up in a different time, so I'll say or do things that aren't necessarily the most popular, and so sometimes
right.
You get slapped. So I find myself kind of withdrawing a little because it can be rather negative.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of my sons is 26, and he has a Facebook page, and he's on Instagram and Snapchat, and he is sort of pulling back from it. He thought he was spending too much time on it and not really getting much out of it. And I thought, he's a classic millennial in that age group. So I thought, if that's how you feel about it, that's what you ought to do. But I do think it can be so consuming that it sort of sucks the life out of you if you're not careful.
Oh, yeah. You have to be very careful. That whole thing. You can't get too wrapped up in it. I think that's the whole thing.
No.
Because there is a real life outside of online. So
right. I mean, there are some important aspects to it. It really has helped, frankly, promote my books. And, these books are available at local bookstores and at Amazon. But like it or not, Amazon sells about 40 to 50% of all the books now. So if you don't have a presence on Amazon, you're not going to sell any books. I personally love bookstores and love to do book signings and love to go there, although all the book signings I had for the summer, have been canceled and hopefully rescheduled. The booksellers are having a really difficult time because, people need to be able to go in and browse, and it's very difficult to do that. So I try and support them in every way I can, but for booksellers, it's a very difficult time.
Yeah. It's certainly it's a whole new world we have to get used to, and I don't know. So what do you got next? What's next? Are you going to continue writing in these series?
Yeah, there's a new book that hopefully will come out. Thank you for asking. It will hopefully come out before the end of the year, which is actually the prequel to the books in this series. That I had, a lot of authors start in the middle of things, which makes interesting. Like that's how Star Wars started, right? But I had a lot of requests, for how did this happen, or how did, Burr's life get turned upside down? So this next book is the prequel to the first three. I don't have a title yet. The first draft is done. I'm in the second draft. I hope it's going to be a great book at the moment. Parts of it I really like and parts that I don't, but that's just how it is. And then I got a couple in the works after that, but that's just how it goes. I try, usually by the time I'm done, I quite like it, but in the middle, sometimes I agonize.
Oh, it's tough. I know. Well, I don't, but it's good. It's a good life. It could be much worse.
Oh, yeah, yes. And a lot of things have been worse and may be worse, so I'm not complaining. It's just difficult. The most therapeutic thing for me when I'm writing a book, I have two dogs, or our family has two dogs, a black lab and an English setter. And when I'm working on a book and stuck, it very much helps me to go walk a dog, because, if you're walking by yourself and you're talking to yourself, people think you're crazy. If you're walking with a dog and you're talking to the dog, no one thinks you're crazy. The dog is happy to hear your voice hopefully, or isn't maybe listening anyway, but things can go on pretty normally that way, and that really helps me with my writing.
Well, there you go. Now I know. Actually, I have a couple of dogs myself, so I understand that totally. Dogs actually are great because they bring you back to the real world too.
Boy, they do. They do. And you probably remember this, but Annie Rooney said the average dog is a nicer person than the average person.
Oh yeah. One of the things
probably right.
Oh yeah, one of the things, I remember being young and my father, we were out driving and a deer came out and he almost hit it, and he said to me very sternly, "You always hit the deer before you hit another human or a car." And
right.
I took that seriously, but now that I'm older, I'm almost thinking the deer is probably nicer. See, those are the things that I get in trouble for.
Right.
I'll say and do something like that, and I'll say, well, I'd rather run over that person than my dog, but...
That's right.
But, I get myself into trouble every time, can't win. But anyway. Well, it's certainly been a pleasure talking with you. I'm glad you took some time, and hope for the best for everything, and hope your books do well.
Thank you, Alan. We're off to a good start, and it was really great to speak with you today, and be part of your show. I wish you continued success.
Well, fantastic. Now, I'm going to have your book and your website up on our website, so people listening can do one click and find you, just in case they can't spell the name. But you never know.
Perfect.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.